Welcome everybody to a book event sponsored by the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. I am Sarah Abervias-Stein, the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Center, a professor of history at UCLA, and the holder of the Viterbi Family Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies at this university. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to one of our first recorded book talks of the 2020-2021 academic year. This event has been sponsored by the Viterbi Family Program in Mediterranean Jewish Studies, and we are so thankful to our supporters and our community for tuning in today. I am delighted to be prepared to turn the podium, as it were, over to two wonderful colleagues, both of whom I consider within the wider UCLA orbit. We are here, of course, to celebrate primarily Simon Levis Sullam, who has recently published a new book, The Italian Executioners, The Genocide of the Jews of Italy, published with Princeton University Press in 2018. And that is the subject of our conversation today. Professor Sullam is Associate Professor of Modern History at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. He specializes in Italian history and Jewish history, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. He has been a fellow of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies at Columbia University, New York, an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, among many other prestigious fellowship holders. His publications include, in addition to this recently published book, a work from 2015 published by Palgrave called Giuseppe Mazzini and the Origins of Fascism. Simon, I consider you a part of the wider UCLA Center for Jewish Studies orbit because I know you did important research and studies here in the course of your training when Saul Friedlander, my esteemed colleague, now retired, was holding the 1939 chair in Holocaust studies, and also that you worked with David Myers, so we welcome you back. In conversation with Simon is our neighbor, Professor Marla Stone, Professor of Modern European History at Occidental College. She has an abiding interest in questions of dictatorship and genocide in the modern era, and particularly the relationship between cultural production, artists, architects, politics, and the state in the 20th century. Marla has published and lectured widely on these topics with a focus on fascist Italy and the memory of the Holocaust. Her books include, from 1998, Princeton University Press, The Patron State, Culture and Politics in Fascist Italy, winner of the Marraro Prize of the Society of Italian Historical Studies, and When the Wall Came Down, published by Routledge in 1992 with Harold James. And as well, The Fascist Revolution in Italy, A Brief History with Documents, published by St. Martin's in 2012. Professor Stone is currently working on a book entitled The Enemy, The Politics and Propaganda of Anti-Communism in Italy. I welcome you to this event. I congratulate Professor Sullam on his recent publication, and I hope to see you at another Levy Center event very soon. Thank you.
Welcome to our virtual audience. I'm thrilled to be here today discussing Simone Levis Sullam's book, The Italian Executioners, The Genocide of the Jews of Italy. I'm gonna hold up the book for our virtual audience to see. This book made a very important contribution to the historiography and evoked a bit of a controversy. And I think that's where we want to start today. It evoked a controversy because it challenged a central narrative about how most Italians understand Italy's role in the Holocaust. And it also challenged popular understandings about the role of anti-Semitism in fascist Italy, particularly during the Second World War. And Simone's book also intervenes in a larger, almost global phenomenon, which is historians and various publics focusing on how different societies have grappled with challenging and dark chapters in their history, something that is happening in the United States now. So Simone, why don't you start by talking about this book's role in coming to terms with the past in Italy?
Well, thank you, Marla. First of all, it's very nice to see you again and to to have the opportunity to discuss my book with you as a scholar of fascism. And I'm very grateful to the Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA for this opportunity. And since I am virtually back at UCLA, let me just recall that part of my academic career started at UCLA with Professor David Myers and Professor Saul Friedlander, who really introduced me to the historiography of the Holocaust. And I started building then the path of studies and research that has led me also to this book. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be back in this, even if in this virtual format. So yes, coming to your question, as you know, well, European societies and particularly Germany, Italy, who have known firsthand fascist experience, but also France and most of Western and even Eastern Europe have dealt in complex ways with the memory of the 20th century, with the memories of totalitarianism, and with the memory of fascism in particular, for which we're thinking especially of Western Europe. And Italy has also had its own problems and issues with which reemerge periodically. And probably we may say that fascism remains a past that has not passed in Italy yet. Italy has had its issues in dealing with this, the complex legacy of 20 years of fascist rule, the legacy of a very wide support that fascism really gained and was able to rely upon for many years. And the size of this consent towards fascism has been measured by historians, but it's still not sufficiently acknowledged, I would say, by the public opinion, and in part also by international historiography. And within this general framework, the question of how fascism has dealt with the Jews has been addressed by historians, but it's still not very well known, especially outside Italy. So the fact that my book was translated for an American public, I hope will contribute with other studies to draw a clearer picture on these on this page of Italian history and of Italian fascism. It's true that Italian fascism was not anti-Semitic from the beginning, as in the case of Nazism, as Nazism was. It did not have anti-Semitism as a pillar of its ideological foundations. But from the mid-30s on, the question of race emerged as a central concern of Mussolini's regime. And this has been put also in relation to Italy's engagement in the colonies, the war on Ethiopia and the conquest of Ethiopia. So the construction of a colonial empire in which the question of race imposed itself, and the affirmation of an Italian race also became very relevant and central to the fascist agenda. And of course, there is the question of the influence of the Catholic tradition, of so-called anti-Judaism, the theological religious tradition, which has a centuries-old tradition in Europe and in Italy with Catholicism in particular, because of the presence of the church, a tradition of anti-Jewish hatred, which was renewed with special intensity in the 19th century, the late 19th century, when the church was confined into the behind the walls of the Vatican, and its role, political role and spiritual role, was diminished by the birth of the Italian state. And anti-Semitism sort of was back on the agenda of the Catholic Church, and this has been studied recently in several books, for example, by David Kurtzer in the United States. Kurtzer, who is incidentally the author of a a warm forward to my book in the American edition. But my book focuses on, and we will talk about it now, on the Holocaust itself. Not on the period of which we can also talk between 1938, when fascism introduced for the first time in the peninsula, the Italian peninsula, racial laws expelling Jews and created a sort of apartheid situation for the Jews. But the situation which determined itself 5 years later in the heart of the Second World War, during the German occupation and during under the so-called Salo Republic, the small state, puppet state or semi-autonomous state, which was established by Mussolini in the center north of Italy in the fall of '43. And in the late fall, Italy joined the German ally in the enforcement of the final solution on the Italian territory, which would eventually lead to the arrest and deportation of about 8,000 Jews and the death of most of them in extermination camp in Eastern Europe, especially Auschwitz. So my book deals with the origin of that experience and tries to analyze in detail the question of the Italian responsibility in the Holocaust in conjunction with the Germans. And this has, assigning a very relevant role, the role of one of the protagonists in this story to Italy, has raised attention and interest in the public opinion and the international press. I do this on the footsteps of some Italian historians who have dealt with this, like Michele Sarfatti, whose work is also translated in the States, or Liliana Picciotto. And I try to tell some day-by-day stories of what happened in Italy between the fall of 1943 and the spring of 1945, at the time of the liberation and the end of the war, when the Germans were kicked out of the country and the remaining fascist regime collapsed.
Yeah. And
so,
I think oh, yes.
Please.
And I think the heart of the matter that perhaps will surprise people and be of great interest is the ways in which the post-war society and government and culture constructed what we call the myth of the good Italian, and the memories of all the things that you map out in your book and that others like Michele Sarfatti have mapped out sort of get forgotten, got sort of pushed to the side. And that it took a long time to get that excavated, even though perhaps it was known in the Jewish community and certainly known by people related to victims and people who had been deported, which I think gets to your core question, which is how do we measure responsibility? Which gets to the question, your title is Italian Executioners, but as you so skillfully present, we're not talking about people who actually committed the executions, who shot people or put them physically in the gas chamber, but rather a whole sort of spectrum of participation, collaboration. And can you talk a little bit about that scheme that you set up between the people who participate in the arrests, who are they, the police versus some of the gangs of the Salo Republic, and then the whole question of informers. And I guess my question to you, once we sort of flesh that out is it fair to call everyone equally a protagonist in the genocide? Right? Do we want to make any distinctions? And is the name executioner completely fair or not?
Yeah.
Question, sorry.
Those are important questions. My intention was to define and to measure, on the basis of available research and based on my own research, the responsibility, the degree of responsibility, the degree of involvement of Italians. And I tried to do so following broader work on the Holocaust, like the classic work by Raoul Hilberg, The Destruction of European Jews, and the work by the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, Modernity and the Holocaust. They have shown that the Holocaust was possible through processes of bureaucratization and through the segmentation of responsibility, the breaking up of responsibility in different segments of different functions, which were all essential to the functioning of the machinery of destruction. Of course, those who were at the beginning of this path of destruction, the bureaucrats especially, or those who only quote unquote performed the arrests and did not perform the killing function, appear less immediately responsible of what they were doing. But without then those who, as you were saying, operated the gas chambers or shot in front of mass graves Jews in Eastern Europe. And this hard function did not concern the Italians. The Italians were not directly involved in the killing operations. The killing operations took place in Eastern Europe, for the Italian Jews in the camps of destruction, in the extermination camps, and especially Auschwitz. So the Italians participated to the first steps of the persecution, which were the drafting of the lists of those to be arrested, the hunt of Jews who were in hiding in Italian cities, but also in Italian small villages or in the countryside. They ran the local concentration camps or transit camps set up in Italy, especially, for example, the major one was set up in Fossoli di Carpi near Modena. That's where also the writer and witness Primo Levi went through when he was arrested in Piedmont and then moved to Fossoli and from there to Auschwitz. So the majority of Italian Jews went through Fossoli. That camp was ran from the fall of 43 to February 44 by Italians only, and later co-run by Germans and Italians. And Italians participated in the plundering of Jewish property, in the seizing and confiscation of Jewish property. And most informants, or all informants, were Italians. Sometimes they were even Jewish, and we can talk about that because there was betrayal also in the communities under the very harsh condition of persecution. Following on the footsteps of
I was just going to say, I'm sorry, Sima.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just in terms of responsibility, do you want to place informers on the same level with the policemen who accompanied the Germans to the roundups? Do we?
No, I mean, we have to clearly have to make a distinction. You're right. Well, first of all, we are not in a courtroom establishing, legal responsibility and assigning, period of imprisonment or, legal culpability. But we do have to make distinctions as historians. What is relevant is that without even these bureaucratic function and without the arrests, the whole machinery would not have been in place and could not even have started. I remember that in a famous documentary by Claude Lanzmann, Raoul Hilberg was interviewed in front of the schedule of trains running through Europe. And they asked him why, and he said, well, because if these trains did not run, we would never have had the Holocaust. So even one, pilot of a train stopping a train could have made possibly some difference. And Italians were running, in fact, trains, were running trucks, were running the buses that escorted Jews from their cities to the transit camps and to the train stations from which they would be shipped to Eastern Europe. They did not kill with their own hands, but they participated in this massacre. And this also allows us to understand more clearly, in a sense, how a genocide can take place. The fact that genocide takes place not exclusively in distant areas or exotic places, but can take place at any time if there are the legal and political condition and social cultural conditions also in our own neighborhood, when part of the population, in a sense, coalesces and comes together with the aim of isolating, deporting, and putting under arrest a segment of the population, depriving it of its normal health conditions, of its means of survival, and of its normal condition of life, and putting them at risk through terrible condition of isolation and in transit camps. Coming to informing, this is a complex issue, but it's clear that one of the reasons why informing was so spread, and it was spread despite the myth of the good Italian, and there were people, selling to Italian authorities and to German authorities their own neighbors. We see that this was spread because, especially because, and precisely because, the violence was not enforced by the informants. Meaning the informant only starts a process in which the violent act is at the very end and does not involve directly in the informant, who can, in a sense, who only deals with the first steps of a process which becomes violent or increasingly violent at the very end of the process.
Be detached from it, which sort of raises another question. Well, sort of two thoughts in response to what you're saying, that the ways in which Italian detachment from responsibility was permitted because the killing went off-site, right? That they could say, well, we took people to Fossili, but we didn't really know what happened after Fossili. That it was, as you said, the chain of responsibility was broken down. And then you had the presence of the Germans, who could easily be blamed for all the bad stuff. And then you could sort of bury the presence of the collaborators. But that really gets me to your discussion of motivation, right? In each national case in the Holocaust, the collaboration, the participation was a combination of pre-existing attitudes towards Jews, pre-existing anti-Semitism, personal motives, conflicts that had happened between people in apartment buildings or neighborhoods, motivations around rewards and money and property. Now you seem to be claiming in the book that anti-Semitism was not a primary ideology, even though you do a nice job of talking about the diffusion of anti-Semitic culture from 1938 forward, right? And I think it's just to stress for people listening that 1938, the racial laws were passed in Italy, limiting Italian participation in the workforce, segregating Italian Jews from schools, making it very hard to live there. And then with the deposition of Mussolini in July 1943, he was deposed by his own Grand Council, and then the occupation of Italy by the German forces from south of Rome and above, you get a very different situation. So the period we're talking about, in the middle of the German occupation, in the period when the Axis is beginning to lose the war, right? The Eastern Front is beginning to go badly, is when the arrests, deportations happen. So my question goes to this issue of motivation, that if you had to come up with a formula, how much
Yes.
do you think it was anti-Semitic ideology, both the short-term intense racial ideology of 1938 to 43, and then the longer-term Catholic anti-Judaism / anti-Semitism, that was very long-term, and then sort of personal grievances, perhaps even careerism in the role of the police and some of the gangs of the Republica of Salo,
Yeah.
and then simple greed, right?
Yes, I think we have to identify, that's a very important question, but first of all, we have to identify different actors who were involved in the persecution and in the rounding up of Jews and the activities of persecution, including the plundering, but also the production of anti-Semitic propaganda, which filled the newspapers of the Salo Republic and the printing I mean, the press and the production of the cultural production of the time, lectures in city halls and in several locations in northern and central Italy. The arrests were conducted and led by Italian police, Italian military police, the Carabinieri, sometimes even the finanzieri, the financial police, especially on the border between Italy and Switzerland. Another actor were the members of the reconstituted Fascist Party. They were members of the party which had made anti-Semitism and had declared officially in November 1943 that Jews were enemy of the Italian state and belonged to a foreign nationality. And then there were volunteers in the ranks of the party. And then there were people who were interested in obtaining economic advantages from the arrests, from the possibility of, for example, moving into the properties, into the apartments left by Jews who were arrested, abandoned by Jews, and which were confiscated, and other motivations like careerism. So there was the elements of constraints and hierarchy and chains of command in the Salo Republic police and army. There were ideological motivations for members of the reconstituted Fascist Party, and there was again greed, financial, the dream of seizing Jewish property, which in many cases was actually achieved. And in the cases of Jews who would not return after the war, there were Jewish properties which remained in the hands of other Italian or of the Italian states, which in the case of Jews who returned or who had remained in hiding, returned the Jewish property, the seized property, with heavy delays and sometimes even with process of further taxation on seized property. And there were, there were absurd situations in the post-war period concerning the confiscation of the property, which we could go into. But to return to, and to be more clear, anti-Semitic propaganda existed. There were a number of Italians acting on the basis of ideological motivation, but many were hunting for enrichment. And another element which counted was the fact that Italy was under basically in 43-45, not only the German occupation, but an open civil war, meaning the split between Italians who supported fascism, reborn fascism under Mussolini and the Germans, and those who fought against it, who were on the side of the Allies and who had joined the resistance. And then, so there was an atmosphere of a fratricidal war in which any Italian represented a potential enemy. There was a sort of an open war among Italians. You could not really trust your neighbor.
And we know that
So the Civil
wars.
War atmosphere, the Civil War atmosphere contributed, and in a sense was a premise to the fact that a segment of the population, which had been the object and the target of anti-Jewish propaganda and persecutions for 5 years before 1943, could be isolated and through a radicalization of the ideological clash, identified as an enemy and as a victim. And this produced also because of the general condition of the war, I think, indifference, lack of empathy, and towards the Jewish community. So it was easy to put in place for the ideologically motivated these policies of arrest and deportation. So there were a specter of motivations, which included also indifference, which included also non-involvement, which included also, to the opposite, the possibility that many Italians rescued the Jews. Sometimes the Jews who paid for being obtaining the possibility of hiding in their neighbors' houses or in the countryside. In other cases, for example, in many instances with the Catholic Church, there were convents which opened their door and actually hid Jewish families, hid Jewish children. Sometimes they would also later try to convert them, but that's another story. They at least rescued them.
Yes, I think you're really right to point to the Civil War, and what we can also think of shifting sovereignties, right? As the Allies moved up the Italian peninsula, more and more territory was in the hands, was liberated and in the hands of the Allies and the partisans, which escalates the intensity, escalates the fratricidal violence. And in that context, people are desperate. The money motivation, the black market motivations all escalate. And I think that's part of what makes the Italian case unique, is the Civil War, the very powerful presence of the partisans, the movement up the peninsula. And I think also, just to reiterate for our audience, that the Jewish population was very small. We're talking about 43,000 Jews at the beginning of the war, of whom 9,000 were deported. So as Simone just said, many people were hidden by local clergy or by friends and neighbors in the countryside. So, certainly a very different story than Eastern Europe. And then the other part of the context that's really important when we try to imagine these arrests and deportations, that at that point, the German forces and the forces of the Republic of Salo had declared a dual enemy of the partisan Jewish enemy, right? So the political enemy and the racial enemy, a version of the Judeo-Bolshevik, right? So it was a multifaceted enemy, and in many of these roundups, they were looking for partisans and found Jews and were happy to take them. So that further complicates the issues of responsibility and perpetration. But I know that this book really wants to focus on the perpetrators, but Simone, how important do you think it is to the way historical memory evolved that the vast majority of Italian Jews present on Italian soil in 1940 did survive? Right?
I think it's of course very important.
Yeah.
It's of course very important. So many Jews were rescued. Many were able to cross the lines where the Allies and the Germans and the fascists fought, and be able to reach Rome, which was soon liberated, or even the South, which was never heavily occupied by the Germans, and where the Salo Republic was never established. But it was the so-called Free Italy, so they were also able to rush down the peninsula. Also, there's the fact that all this happened towards the end of in the second half of the war. So the German occupation did not last for so long as it did in other parts of Europe. I think it is interesting to reflect more generally on how the myth of the good Italian was formed and was shaped, as you were saying. This image of a benevolent Italian, Catholic, moderate, generous, and of fascism as a lesser evil. I think we should stress that Italian fascism, was a violent and criminal regime since at least the mid-20s. So it wasn't the racial laws.
I would argue, as you well know, during its assumption of power.
The break of the liberal order already, of the liberal state, and of the rules of a liberal democracy already took place with the seizure of power in the fall of 22 in October, at the end of October 22, and then there was a gradual sort of the dismantling of democratic rules and democratic rights and freedom of press, and the major onslaught took place from early January 1925. But the violence on the streets had already, involved Italy in the early 20s with a sort of an initial quasi-civil war among political forces on the left.
And because we're all thinking, here in the United States about political violence as, is it a precursor to something? It's really important to note that the regime created all this chaos in the streets and fought its political enemies before it came to power, right? From 1919 forward to create.
Yeah, absolutely. You were talking
of present itself as the force for law and order.
Yeah. You were talking of the socialist and communist enemies, the topic you know very well from your own research, and I think that was the first and foremost enemy, internal enemy that fascism identified in the Italian nation after the First World War, and then gradually, the communist was replaced in part by the Jew in the late 30s, but they were also intertwined.
I would jump in. I think the next enemy and the next violence is happening in the colonies. Right, so in the 30s,
right. You were saying
concentration camps in Libya, and when we think about the Holocaust, we primarily talk about the German case. So much is learned in the colonies, right, in the treatment of colonial peoples, and very few people know that 300,000 Libyans were subjected to Italian concentration camps in the early 1930s.
Yeah, so fascism was already in the mid-30s. You're absolutely right to point that out. Was already in the early 30s enforcing de facto genocidal policies in Libya for the control of the Libyan territory, and but persecuting Libyans on ethnic basis, and imprisoning them in concentration camps, which basically, because of the health condition, non-existent health conditions, were turned into extermination camps. And there is this whole theme of the fact that fascism was basically planning the creation of a new Mediterranean order, which would complement the new European order of the Nazis, but had really thought about it in part already in liberal Italy, when Crispi, one of the first, post-unification prime minister, our own Iron Chancellor, a kind of an Italian Bismarck, really looked at the Mediterranean as an area where the Roman myth of the the Mare Nostrum, our own sea would be revived, and an Italian empire would be established through colonial domination. And
Right.
we
And
know that
so,
colonialism has as an intrinsic aspect racism. So Italians, it's hard to conceive from an American perspective and thinking of Italian-American legacies, but Italians had built their own racist tradition, and there are
that's right.
studies which show that also in the rising social sciences, medicines, and Italy had its own eugenic tradition in which the question of Italian numbers and how to strengthen the Italian population became very relevant in the academic agenda, and soon enough also in the political agenda for a state which wanted to affirm itself on the European and international scene.
Right. That's why I think it's important to link the violence in Libya in the early 30s, the violence in Ethiopia, the war crimes in Ethiopia in 1935 and 1936, and the creation of racial laws in the empire and racial regimes in the empire to what happens during the war. And there's a whole sort of new historiography that links violence in the borderlands, in the colonies, to violence in the metropole. And I think that schema works for Italy. And then you get the shifting sovereignties and you get the civil war, and all of this escalates. So
fascism really did try to build a new Italian that was basically racist in the colonies, on the borderlands, and in the country itself, and which was counterposed by two inferior races, which were African, but also Slavic, and finally Jewish. And this picture was, in a sense, soon forgotten in favor of a very positive image, which counterposed Italian benevolence to German ferocity. I think we need to study, and this has been shown by historiography, different paths towards totalitarianism, different uses of violence, and different ways in which ideological tradition, in a sense, join forces with violent practices and produce, at the end, within the context of a world war, genocide, or at least the sharing of the responsibilities of genocide.
Right.
And this was largely forgotten also in Italy through a very limited number of trials in courtrooms after the war. There was never an Italian Nuremberg, so to speak, and there was soon large amnesties, which because Italy, as most of Europe, needed to turn the page and to, in a sense, forget what had happened and move ahead and move forward. And soon everything was, in a sense, blocked under the Cold War, in which different new allegiances came to the fore, and in which the anti-communist counterposition counted much more than previous fascist legacies and responsibilities.
Yeah, I think we've sort of highlighted a number of things that people who study the Holocaust don't often realize, things that are sort of assumed about Italy. I think most people don't know that there were camps on Italian soil. They don't know about the presence of fossili di Carpi or San Saba. People are not aware that there really was no Nuremberg, that there was no major trial of Italian perpetrators. And then the speed and vastness of the amnesties, right? The amnesties supported by Togliatti, by the head of the Communist Party, I think most people find very surprising. So in many ways, the Italian trajectory is unique and really did create a culture where forgetting or burying the past was easy. And, we were talking about the colonial past. That also has not become part of the popular narrative, just beginning in the last few years. So maybe Simone, well, there's sort of two things I'd like you to do before we close. Maybe to jump back to the story of the Holocaust in Italy and give us a couple of specific cases that you find particularly interesting. The story of a particular family, something about the roundup in Rome, I think people would find very interesting.
Yeah. Well, Rome was an important case, although the 16 October 1943 roundup was with the support of the Italian policemen carried out mostly by Germans. So I have been more interested in instances in northern Italy, which, for example, I studied closely in the archives the situation in Venice. And there you see the volunteers of the Fascist Party and the policemen moving around the city at night and finding Jewish families in their own apartments, separating children from their parents and jailing separately men, women, children, and elderly. You see Venice, the Venice we still know today, turn into the site of the initial steps of a genocide. A school turned into a transit camp, a vaporetto, a water bus used for the transportation of Jews. And we have the report of a direct witness of this. And we see the house of the elderly in the ghetto of Venice. Venice had created the first ghetto in the 16th century, and in a sense, the ghetto, or that ghetto function was revived by the Italians, and the Jewish population that was rounded up was concentrated again within that neighborhood in a rest house, a rest home, where all the segment of the population was arrested and then was transported by train to Fossoli, the transit camp, where they were then turned to the Germans. But from Venice, there are stories of a group of small children aged between 3 and 6 who were transported by the Carabinieri, the military police, several weeks after their parents. And the local chief of the police says, well, they were, reunited to their families, but it's clear that they knew that they were going to be turned to the Germans and shipped to Eastern Europe. I've been often asked whether all the people who were part of these processes were aware of the final result, the final tragedy to which they delivered these people. And it is now known that there were news about, camps in Germany or Eastern Europe generically. Some thought they were labor camps, some thought they were camps of imprisonment. I think all the people who participated in these processes, including the bureaucratic processes of only drafting the list of Jews to be arrested, knew that they were participating in a process of persecution. Perhaps they didn't know that the final result would be death, but they knew that they were participating in a process of arrest, segregation, confiscation of wealth, and isolation and deportation of the population. So they were aware that it was a process of, it was a violent process, basically, which involved Italian citizens of all ages, which were singled out because they were Jewish. So they were aware of this because fascism had insisted on an anti-Jewish policies in the last 5 years, and they had used all their means, all their propaganda means, newspapers, also school books, to enforce this new anti-Semitic ideology. And when we look, to go back to stories at the cities in northern Italy, we find intellectuals entertaining, Italian intellectuals entertaining, the public opinion with lectures on the Jews as Christ killers, on the Jews as a cancer of humanities. So also the major publishers in Italy, like Mondadori in Milan, they published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and there were lectures given on this in St. Mark
And
Square.
we also see in this period the importation of a lot of German anti-Semitic propaganda.
Yes.
Really the escalation of the Jewish enemy using a sort of Nazi terminology. Simone, I think a really interesting place to maybe jump to now is attempts to come to terms with the past, right? There's an attempt to build a museum of the Holocaust. There are more memorials in Italy in recent years. Can you talk a little bit about whether you think things are being addressed now and how they're being addressed? And is the Italian public more open to questions of responsibility?
Well, first of all, there is a growing interest in Jewish culture. For a long time, the Jew was a sort of a mysterious object for the for Italian society and the Italian public opinion. You have to think that the Italian Jewish community remains a very small community of 30,000 people on a population of 60 million. So, and the Jewish culture is not as mainstream as it is in the U.S. And it's but through an interest in Jewish writers and even in the Israeli culture, this has changed, at least with an intellectual public. And also, since the year 2000, the Italian state, as most European states, all European states, has created a Day of Remembrance, which is celebrated on January 27th, which is the day of the liberation of the camp of Auschwitz.
Right. I think that's something very interesting we probably don't have time to talk about, but to at least acknowledge that the day of commemoration moved from April 25th, the day of the liberation, which is something that took place on Italian soil and was about fascism, under the Berlusconi government, to the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, which is kind of a displacement. That happened over there. That was not anything.
Yeah, there was a whole debate when the National Day of Remembrance should be, which date should be picked. And in the end, they had to settle for a date which doesn't really involve the Italian history and especially Italian responsibility. And it's interesting to notice that the law that establishes the Day of Remembrance says that the persecutions should be remembered and the righteous, those who saved the Jews and rescued the Jews, but there's no mentioning of the persecutors as an active subject, nor the word fascism is mentioned in the law that established Days of Remembrance.
So there's kind of a simultaneous process of continuing the forgetting for political purposes and then certain constituencies wanting to remember and commemorate.
Yeah, so it's clear that it's unclear what Italians should exactly remember in terms of their own responsibility in the Holocaust Day of Remembrance. But this has produced a broader awareness in school and in educational projects, and we now have 2 or even 3 projects of Holocaust museums. There is a museum of the Jewish experience and the Holocaust in Ferrara, which was picked also because of the novel of Bassani, The Garden of the Finzi Contini, also a well-known film about a Jewish family in central Italy, in the town of Ferrara. There is a project in Rome, and there is a project in Milan, and it's interesting to see what will actually happen of these projects. Perhaps now there are too many, and we will see what really comes out. There is almost a process of competition among different agencies, Jewish communities.
How far along are the Roman and Milanese projects?
I would say that the most advanced is probably the museum in Ferrara, which has the support of the government, of the state, and is actually perhaps more appropriately museum on the history of the Jews of Italy and of the Holocaust, because we should remember that the Italians were one of the most ancient Jewish groups Jewish population in the Mediterranean, and so the Jewish presence go back to the Romans, and it's been one of the centers, the cultural intellectual centers of the Jewish diaspora through the centuries, since the Renaissance and the flowering of Talmudic schools and even of the printing press in the Renaissance, before coming to the period of emancipation and to the dark pages of the Holocaust. So there are hopes that the Italians will be able to build a culture of remembrance, but this does involve the fact that they will have to deal with their own responsibilities and no longer only consider racism, anti-Semitism, colonialism, and the Holocaust as the responsibility of others. And I think this can only be done when the criminal nature of fascism, which after all was invented in Italy, will be acknowledged, and we will start deconstructing and the myth of the good Italian.
Right, exactly. Unfortunately, things seem to be moving not exactly in the directions one would like, with the rise of the League and a racist political party, and Matteo Salvini, who sort of covers for fascism, tweets quotes by Mussolini. So I guess my final question for you would be, what can we learn from the Italian case? What have been the costs of burying the memory of Italian participation in the Holocaust, burying some of the aspects of the criminality of fascism? Has it had a damaging effect on Italian democracy? I think it has, but I'd like to know what you think about the long-term.
Yeah, I think once again, for a long time, the large support that fascism had received in the ventennio, in the 20 years of rule by Mussolini between 1922 and 1943, was not really acknowledged. After the liberation in April 1945, most Italians considered themselves anti-fascist, declared themselves anti-fascist, and it was unclear how the regime had been built and how it had ruled with the support of millions of Italians, shaping the life of Italians for really 20 years. So Italian culture and Italian political culture was built on forgetfulness and on oblivion, and this is true probably for most of Europe. But there are countries like France and Germany who, since the 90s, have dealt in more direct ways with their responsibilities in the Second World War and their allegiance to fascism. I think of France. The Italian state has never acknowledged openly its responsibility in the deportation of Jews and in the confiscation of Jewish property. There was a special report initiated by the Italian government in 2001, but the political consequences and there were no political decision that followed the mapping of the seizure of property and the confiscation of property by what was in fact the representative at the time of the Italian state, the Italian Salo Republic.
Right.
So there is still much to be done. I think we can learn from the Italian case the complexities of the general European involvement in genocide, the fact that the Holocaust could never have been carried out without the support of fascist Nazis allies, but of millions of Europeans who performed limited functions which were all necessary to the functioning of the machinery of destruction.
Absolutely.
And I think looking at those responsibility will make Europe more aware of its historical responsibility and also the responsibility it has towards its future, in a sense, facing what has been the past and the past legacies which come from fascism and Nazism, would make Europe more aware of the ways in which it has to take responsibility for new minorities and for new groups that are now at danger within European societies. For example, those who today try to cross the Mediterranean and to
That's
enter
right.
our
And we've
own
seen the persecution of
society.
gypsies on Italian soil. Absolutely. I mean, we could even make the broad claim that an embrace of a widespread and nuanced understanding of responsibility could make us more vigilant in the present and help us prevent the normalization of these ideas. Because what is happening in Europe today and in Italy is a certain kind of normalization of racism, of authoritarianism, or of what we're calling illiberal democracy. So this is a past that has not passed, but it is important for us to keep talking about and attempt to process. So I think with that, I will thank you.
Yes.
Lively discussion. I'm sorry that we are not live and can't take any questions, but perhaps in the future we will do this again in person.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your time, for the wonderful questions, and for this great exchange of ideas and conversation. I hope we have given some food for thought to some of our listeners, and that facing these complicated issues will make us more aware and responsible, both in Europe and the US, as we look to our respective future, and perhaps we can join forces in making this future better.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Marla.